on a frozen slope in the northern Urals. Sometime after dark, 9 experienced hikers were still inside their tent. The wind was pushing hard across the mountain. Snow was building against the fabric. Their boots were off. Their gear was still where it should have been. For a few more minutes, it could have looked like nothing was wrong. Then something changed. Not gradually. Not the kind of danger that gives people time to debate. Something sharp enough, sudden enough, and terrifying enough that the tent was cut open from the inside. They did not leave through the entrance. They tore their way out into the night, into sub-zero cold, into near-total darkness, into a mountainside that offered no shelter, no second chance, and no clear way back. By the time rescuers found the camp, the scene looked less like a simple accident than the aftermath of a panic nobody could fully explain. The tent stood damaged on the slope. The bodies were scattered downhill. Some were found half-dressed in the snow. Others carried injuries that did not seem to belong to an ordinary winter death. And that was the beginning of the real problem. Because Dyatlov Pass did not become one of the world's most enduring mysteries only because 9 people died there. It became a mystery because the evidence seemed to suggest that, in the final minutes before they ran into the dark, something happened on that mountain that did not fully fit the story anyone would prepare to tell. For decades, Dyatlov Pass has been treated like a blank screen for fear, a Soviet cover-up, a secret weapons test, an unknown attacker, something inhuman on the mountain, something so strange that 9 trained hikers fled their tent half-dressed into lethal cold and never made it back. That is the version of the story most people recognize. But the real question is harder than that, and in some ways more disturbing. Not simply what killed them, but why this case still feels resistant to closure. Even after decades of theories, reopened inquiries, and modern scientific attempts to explain what happened on that slope in February 1959. Russian prosecutors later backed a natural explanation centered on avalanche, and a 2021 peer-reviewed study argued that a delayed slab avalanche could plausibly account for the tent evacuation and some of the injuries. Because if this was only a tragic mountain accident, why did the evidence look so unnatural for so long? And if it was something more than an accident, why has no theory ever managed to explain the entire scene without forcing the facts? So, this is not going to be a story that simply retells the legend. We're going back to mountain, back to the expedition, back to the official record, and back to the details that never quite fit cleanly together. Not to chase the loudest theory, but to understand how one night in the Urals turned into one of the most enduring mystery files in modern history. Before Dyatlov Pass became a legend, it was just a winter expedition, not a ghost story, not a classified Soviet nightmare, not yet a global mystery file discussed decades later on television, in documentaries, and across the internet. It began as a kind of journey that, at least on paper, made sense to the people taking it. In January 1959, a group from a Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on a long ski trek through the northern Urals. There were 10 members at the start. Most were students in their early 20s. One was an older sports instructor and war veteran. They were not amateurs wandering into the snow for a thrill. They were experienced hikers attempting a demanding route that qualified for the highest category of winter trekking certification then recognized in the Soviet system. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student whose name would later be given to the pass itself. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back early because of worsening illness and joint pain, leaving the remaining 9 to continue without him. That matters, because the story only becomes frightening once you understand what it was not. This was not a reckless party, not a group of tourists lost on their first hard climb, not people walking blindly into whether they did not understand. The official image of the expedition, both then and later, was almost reassuring. These were disciplined young Soviet hikers doing something difficult but normal within their world. Planning routes, keeping diaries, taking photographs, moving through snow with the seriousness of people who had trained for this kind of hardship. Their final rolls of film and notebook entries would later help investigators reconstruct the last ordinary days of the trip, and those traces of normalcy would make what came next feel even more wrong. The world around them also matters. This was the Soviet Union in 1959, a society built on systems, hierarchy, institutional confidence, and carefully managed narratives. In that setting, remote hardship was not unusual. Grueling expeditions were part sport, part endurance culture, part proof of discipline. If a trained team set out into the winter wilderness, the default assumption was not mystery. The default assumption was competence. Even when danger existed, it was expected to fit into familiar categories: weather, injury, navigation, exposure. And for a while, everything still looked ordinary. The group traveled by train and truck, then moved by ski deeper into the region. Their diaries and photos suggest a team still operating within the routines of expedition life, joking, documenting the landscape, managing supplies, and pushing through harsh terrain one stage at a time. On February 1st, they made camp on the slopes of Kolitsekl, a mountain in the area whose name is often translated as Dead Mountain. The detail sounds like something invented later by the legend, but the mountain was real, the route was real, and the camp they established there would become the fixed point around which the entire mystery would turn. And this is where the tension begins, because nothing in the world before the mystery suggests the kind of ending that followed. The team had experience. They had structure. They had a route. They had shelter. They had every reason to believe that the mountain was dangerous in the usual way. But beneath that appearance of order was a fragile truth that almost every great mystery depends on. People do not need to be careless to become vulnerable. They only need one environment, one decision, one hidden force, or one failed assumption that turns skill into exposure faster than the mind can catch up. At Dyatlov Pass, the world before the mystery looked stable enough that, when the break finally came, it would leave behind something far more haunting than a simple accident. It would leave behind a scene that looked as if the mountain had interrupted reality itself. The break did not arrive as a public event. There was no alarm that night, no witness standing at a distance, no final radio call, no official record written in the moment the danger began. What happened on the slope had to be reconstructed later, from absence, from weather, from footprints, from the layout of a torn tent, and from bodies found in stages beneath the mountain. That is one reason the case has never fully released its grip. The most important part of the story began in darkness, and by the time anyone else reached that campsite, the sequence had to be read backward. The hikers were expected to send a telegram after returning to the settlement at the end of their route. When that message did not arrive on time, there was no immediate sense of global mystery, only concern that the group might be delayed. In winter expeditions, delay was not automatically disaster, but concern grew and search efforts began. On February 26, rescuers reached the group's camp on the eastern slope of Kolitsekl. What they found was not a campsite that had slowly failed. It was a campsite that seemed to have been abandoned in the middle of an emergency. The tent was still there, partly covered by snow, damaged and cut open. Investigators concluded that it had been slashed from the inside. Inside and around it were boots, warm clothing, food, and other supplies that should not have been left behind by people making any normal decision to move into sub-zero night conditions. Whatever drove them out appears to have done so fast enough that they did not stop to dress properly, and serious enough that using the tent entrance either felt too slow or no longer felt safe. Then came the tracks. Searchers reported a line of footprints leading away from the tent and down the slope toward a wooded area, suggesting that at least some of the group had left on foot rather than being thrown, scattered, or chased in total chaos. That detail matters because it creates the first deep contradiction in the case. The departure appears urgent, but not completely random. It looks like panic, but panic with movement still coherent enough to produce a trail. The first two bodies were found near the edge of a cedar tree, not far from the forest line. They were underdressed for the conditions. Nearby were signs of a small fire, as if at least some of the group had made it down from the exposed slope and tried to survive long enough to build heat and think. More bodies were found later between the cedar and the tent, suggesting that some of the hikers may have attempted to return uphill. That possibility is devastating, because it implies that whatever forced them out may not have stayed with them. They may have fled one danger only to realize, too late, that exposure itself had become the greater one. But the case became stranger still when the remaining bodies were discovered months later beneath deeper snow in a ravine. These hikers were found in a different setting from the first victims, and some of them had far more severe injuries, including major chest and skull trauma. Soviet investigators later concluded that 6 of the 9 died from hypothermia, while 3 died from fatal injuries. That split is one of the central fractures in the case file. If this was a straightforward cold weather escape from the tent, why were some injuries so extreme? And if those injuries came from external force, why did the overall scene still contain so many signs of improvised survival rather than a single violent attack? This is the moment where the case stops being only a tragedy and becomes a mystery, because the official story of a winter expedition breaking down in severe conditions can explain part of the slope. But the scene discovered by rescuers did not feel like one clean sequence. It felt layered. First, the abrupt evacuation, then the descent, then the attempts to survive, then the dead near the tree, then the dead on the way back, then the ravine, then the injuries. And by the time Soviet authorities formally closed the case, they did so with one of the most infamous phrases in mystery history. The hikers, they said, had died because of a compelling natural force. The line sounded less like an explanation than a door being shut. And once that door closed, everything left outside it only grew darker. This is the point where Dyatlov Pass stops behaving like a difficult survival story and starts behaving like a damaged file. Because the problem was never that there were no explanations. The problem was that the scene seemed to produce 2 realities at once. One reality looked natural: a winter slope, extreme cold, a rushed evacuation, a failed attempt to survive in the dark. The other looked wrong in a way that refused to settle. A tent cut open from the inside, people leaving behind boots and warm clothing, bodies found in different zones under different conditions, and injuries that made the final scene feel more violent than a simple escape into the cold should have been. The first thing that does not fit is the decision to leave the tent the way they did. Even if a threat emerged suddenly, the tent was still their best protection against wind and exposure. That is what makes the cut canvas so haunting. It suggests not just urgency, but a form of urgency so immediate that staying inside felt more dangerous than running into the night half-dressed. Any explanation of the case has to answer that first. What could have made experienced hikers believe the tent itself was no longer safe? The second thing that does not fit is the strange mix of order and disorder in the escape. The footprints leading away from the tent imply the group did not explode outward in blind chaos. They moved downhill in a pattern that, at least at first, retained some coherence. That matters because it complicates the most dramatic theories. This was not a scene of obvious massacre, not a battlefield, not the aftermath of a wild attack visible in every direction. And yet it was also not the clean logic of a controlled retreat. It sits in an uncomfortable middle zone, organized enough to leave a trail, desperate enough to abandon survival gear. The third thing that does not fit is the split in the deaths themselves. Some of the hikers appear to have died in the most brutally ordinary way a winter mountain can kill people, through cold, exhaustion, and exposure. But others were found with severe internal injuries, including chest trauma and skull damage. That split is central to the entire mythology of the case. It is why the official file never felt emotionally complete. A single mechanism can explain a lot at Dyatlov Pass. But for decades, very few people believed it could explain that combination of panic, exposure, and physical damage without leaving clearer marks of what had happened. The fourth thing that does not fit is the language of the original Soviet conclusion. A compelling natural force is not really a public explanation. It is a phrase that sounds like an answer while preserving the emptiness underneath it. It tells you that the state wanted the case closed, but not necessarily clarified. And in a system already shaped by hierarchy and opacity, that kind of wording was almost guaranteed to create suspicion, not because it proves a cover-up by itself, but because it leaves exactly the kind of vacuum conspiracy theories need in order to survive. And that leads to the fifth thing that does not fit, which may be the most powerful of all. Over time, the case accumulated details that sounded even more unnatural than the original file already did. Missing soft tissue, rumors of radiation, stories of glowing objects in the sky, whispers about military testing. Some of those details had real roots in the record. Some were exaggerated by retelling. Some belonged to the long afterlife of the story rather than the first hard layer of evidence. But Once those fragments attached themselves to Dyatlov Pass, the case stopped being just a mountain tragedy. It became a magnet for every explanation that feeds on incomplete information. That is why this file endured. Not because every strange detail points in the same direction, but because they do not. They pull the mind apart, toward nature, toward secrecy, toward accident, toward cover-up, toward something almost supernatural. And when a case can hold all those directions at once without fully collapsing into any one of them, it stops feeling like a closed event. It starts feeling like a permanent argument. Once a case like this survives long enough, it stops having one explanation and starts collecting layers. That is what happened at Dyatlov Pass. Over time, the mountain did not just produce theories. It produced camps. People who believe the mystery has essentially been solved. People who believe the truth was buried under Soviet language and missing transparency. And people who believe the official explanations only work if you ignore the most disturbing parts of the file. So the only useful way to approach this now is not to ask which theory sounds most dramatic. It is to ask which theory explains the most evidence at the lowest cost. The strongest modern explanation is the avalanche theory, more specifically a delayed slab avalanche scenario. For years, many people dismissed avalanche as too simple. The slope did not look steep enough. There were no huge cinematic signs of total burial, and the tent was still partly standing when rescuers found it. But that is exactly why the later scientific work mattered. Researchers argued that a smaller slab avalanche, triggered after the group cut into the slope to pitch the tent, could explain why they suddenly felt forced to get out, why they left quickly, and why some of the more severe injuries did not need an attack, an explosion, or a supernatural event to exist. In that model, the tent did not have to vanish under a giant wall of snow. It only had to become unsafe enough, fast enough, for experienced hikers to make a desperate decision under extreme conditions. Russian prosecutors had already publicly backed avalanche as the most likely cause, and the 2021 study gave that conclusion a much stronger mechanical argument. That theory is powerful because it explains several things at once. It explains the panic. It explains the cut tent. It explains why they moved away from the exposed slope. It helps explain at least part of the injury puzzle. And after that initial break, it allows the rest of the deaths to unfold through cold, darkness, disorientation, and failed survival decisions rather than through a second hidden force. But it is not a perfect explanation. Its weakness is not that it is impossible. Its weakness is that Dyatlov Pass still feels visually wrong to people who imagine avalanche only as a giant, obvious catastrophe. Even when the mechanics are plausible, the case still carries a psychological residue of mismatch. That is why the avalanche theory may be the best explanation on the table, and still fail to satisfy everyone emotionally. The second major explanation is violent wind, often discussed as katabatic wind. This theory suggests the group may have faced an extreme wind event strong enough to make staying in the tent feel untenable, forcing them to seek shelter lower on the slope and nearer the tree line. Its appeal is obvious. It can explain the sudden evacuation without requiring a heavy snow impact at the tent itself. It also fits the logic of experienced hikers making a fast, tactical move rather than fleeing pure irrational terror. But it is weaker than the slab avalanche explanation when it comes to the most severe internal injuries, because the wind theory usually has to add a second stage of collapse, fall, or burial later in the sequence to account for them. In other words, it explains the exit better than it explains the whole file. Then there is the military or cover-up layer. This is a theory family that refuses to die, and not by accident. Part of that is cultural. A Soviet-era mystery in a remote region, closed with vague language, almost invites suspicion. Part of it is forensic. Some injuries look severe. Some later details, including traces associated with radiation in parts of the record, help keep the idea alive. And part of it is narrative gravity. Once people suspect the state was involved, every ambiguity starts looking less like a gap and more like a seal placed over the truth. The most common version here is some kind of weapons test, parachute mine, or military activity in the area. Why does that theory hold on? Because it seems to solve the emotional problem of the case. It offers a reason for internal injuries, a reason for panic, a reason for official vagueness, a reason for why some things in the file feel incomplete. but its weakness is serious. No version of the military theory has managed to explain the whole scene cleanly with hard evidence strong enough to displace the natural explanations. It survives because it fits the atmosphere of the case, not because it closes a record better than the leading natural model. And then there is the outer ring of the legend. UFOs, orange lights, unknown creatures, paranormal attack. The idea that something non-human moved through that mountain and left behind a scene too strange for ordinary language. These are the theories that gave Dyatlov Pass its longest afterlife in popular culture. They are also the weakest in evidentiary terms. They thrive not because a file demands them, but because a file leaves enough darkness for imagination to enter and refuse to leave. A mystery can generate supernatural storytelling without requiring a supernatural cause. So where does that leave the map? The most credible explanation today is still a natural one, centered on a slab avalanche or closely related snow event, followed by exposure and a chain of survival failures in impossible conditions. The most emotionally satisfying alternative, for many viewers, is some form of military secrecy or hidden state activity. And the most culturally powerful version of the story is the supernatural one, because it transforms an already damaged file into a permanent myth. That is why the argument never fully ends. Each layer explains a different kind of discomfort. Science explains the mechanics. Secrecy explains the distrust. Myth explains the fear. And at Dyatlov Pass, all three have been competing for control of the same frozen night ever since. What Dyatlov Pass ultimately reveals is not just how people die in extreme conditions. It reveals how mystery is born when evidence, authority, and imagination fail to settle into the same shape. That is the deeper reason this case survived. If the scene on the mountain had pointed cleanly in one direction, the story would have ended as a tragedy. If the official explanation had been clear, specific, and persuasive, the public memory might have cooled with time. And if later science had arrived early enough to close the emotional gap, Dyatlov Pass might have remained a grim footnote in Soviet mountaineering history. Instead, the case developed in the worst possible way for closure. The original investigation ended in language vague enough to preserve suspicion, and the strongest modern explanation only arrived decades later, after the mystery had already fused itself to conspiracy culture. By then, Dyatlov Pass was no longer just a case. It was a myth with an audience. And myths do not survive because they are the most accurate version of events. They survive because they explain a psychological need. Dyatlov Pass gives people something modern life rarely tolerates well: a blank space, a place where the record exists, but not cleanly, a place where the facts are real, but do not arrive in a form that feels emotionally complete, a place where science can explain much of the mechanism, yet still leave behind the human terror of that final night. That tension is exactly why the case became a long-running magnet for conspiracy theories, supernatural retellings, and endless reinterpretation. So in the end, Dyatlov Pass may say less about monsters on a mountain than about what people do when a story contains too much fear, too much silence, and just enough evidence to keep certainty out of reach. It is a case about exposure, about trust, about how weak explanations create stronger legends, and about how, once a damaged file enters public imagination, the mystery is no longer living only in the event itself. It is living in us. Somewhere on that slope, in the space between the tent and the tree line, the story broke beyond recovery, not because every detail was unknowable, but because the final minutes were just clear enough to disturb us and just incomplete enough to stay alive. 9 people walked into the northern Urals with skill, planning, and purpose. Only one came back, and he came back only because he turned away before the mountain closed behind the rest. The other 9 were left to history, to a fractured investigation, and to a mystery that would outlive the Soviet Union itself. Today, the most credible explanation points toward a natural chain of events: a snow slab, a sudden evacuation, catastrophic exposure, desperate attempts to survive, and a sequence of injuries and decisions made under conditions almost impossible to reverse. But the emotional life of Dyatlov Pass has never belonged to explanation alone. It belongs to that image of the cut tent on the slope, to the footprints leading into darkness, and to the feeling that the mountain kept one part of the truth for itself. And maybe that is why this case never really ends. Because Dyatlov Pass is no longer only a Soviet tragedy. It is a permanent file in the modern imagination, a reminder that sometimes the most enduring mysteries are not the ones with no answers, but the ones where the answers arrive too late, too cold, and never quite in the shape we were hoping for.